Hey guys, how's it going? Hopefully you read chapter 9 yesterday. If not, pause the video, go read it. Because this is one of the longest chapters in the book at about 19 pages. It's also probably the most important chapter in the book. It's a pretty heavy chapter. There's a lot that goes on in it. Again, I don't want to spoil it for you. If you haven't already read it, please pause the video, go do that. Um, but in this chapter, obviously, we get the rumble between the Greasers and the Socias, the big fight, which feels like it should be the climax of the book, right? It's the big moment of action. It seems like things have kind of been building to with that man versus society, this class warfare. But it doesn't feel like anywhere near the most important part of the chapter. It only takes up a few pages of the chapter itself, and it's certainly important, but I think it's more important for what it symbolizes than for what actually happens during it, because nothing of great importance actually happens during it. Um, Again, we start off with they're eating at home. It talks a little bit about their home life between Soda, Dairy, and Pony Boy. Some of the other greasers come over and they get all dressed up. They get ready. They're trying to look kind of intimidating to go to this fight with all the socias. And they get to the fight, and all the other greasers are there from these different gangs. And Pony Boy, he's thinking about his gang, and he's thinking about how Derry's this big muscled up guy, so you can see all his muscles through his shirt. He talks about how he always kept his hair really short and clean cut. Again, he looks like a Soch. He looks like a guy who should be out there playing football for a college team, not like some guy who should be in a gang battle on the side of a concrete lot somewhere. Um, so he notices this about Derry and how he doesn't seem to fit in. Then he has for the first time the realization, the click, that he and Soda don't belong there either, that they're also destined for something better than that. But at the same time, he's got a little bit of a blind spot. He says, our gang, we're just some guys who hang out together. He says, a lot of these guys are future convicts from these other gangs. He says we don't belong with them, but he's stereotyping them in the same way that so many people stereotype the greasers. So it's another one of those little blind spots that Pony Boy has. I hope we recognize that he turns around from saying, well, we're not all like that, to saying they all are, even though he doesn't necessarily know all of them by name. He doesn't know them personally. There might be a kid just like him in one of those other groups. So Pony Boy, this is what I talk about where he's not completely reliable. He's smart, and I think most of the time we can trust his observations and what he says, but sometimes we have to read a little bit deeper than just Pony Boy's own opinions, because they're not always perfect. Because it's not until this chapter, for the first time, he kind of realizes, Derry's not going to be like this forever. He's not going to be a greaser forever. He's going to work and he's going to make something of himself. And then he has that moment where he says, "I am too." He's like, "I don't belong here either. Soda doesn't belong here." Um, so it's one of those first moments where he realizes this isn't the life that I want. This isn't what I want to be. Um, because he's thinking as they go to the fight, what the reasons that his group like fighting. He says Steve does it for hatred. Soda does it for fun. Derry does it to show off, to impress people, because he likes to assert his strength. He says, and Two Bit just does it for conformity, which means to follow along with the crowd, to do what everyone else is doing. He says, I don't know why I do it. I think the truth is it's probably a little bit of all of those reasons for Pony Boy. He feels like he has something to prove, being the youngest of the group. So kind of like Derry, he's trying to assert himself. He also has fun being with the group and getting into things like that. Even if he doesn't necessarily like a fight, I think he likes the action of it. I think he likes the excitement. And I think a lot of it's conformity, like Two Bit. I think he follows along with the crowd pretty heavily. We talked about that earlier with some of our discussion questions. How Pony Boy's this brilliant kid with all this going on inside, this kind of rich internal monologue going on, and yet he's very much a follower. He's not a leader, and part of that comes from being 14 and hanging out with kids who are older than him, which is fair. But again, he's got that blind spot with himself and his own motivations. So he's a kid that, again, he's got a lot of bright things that he says, a lot of bright things he notices, but there's a lot that goes right over his head, and it's because of his age, not anything with intelligence. He's not lacking in that department, but he's young, and when you're young, you miss certain things that you won't when you're older. Me reading this book as an adult, I probably get things out of it that I wouldn't have at your age, and that you probably don't get out of it, and that's not any difference in intellectual level from me to you. It's a difference in age and maturity. If you revisit this book in 10 years, you'll get things out of it that you're not getting out of it now, which I hope you do. It's a good book. I hope you do revisit it throughout your life, because I get things out of it. And there's that interesting, fun little bit where they talk about the acrobatics, that Derry caught all of them and how they can all do flips and things, which I think is kind of funny. and they start doing their little chant about the greasers and the socias. It's on page 136, which is pretty entertaining, and it's indicative of a lot of things. They talk about the stereotypes of the greaser as a hood, somebody who blackens the name of the city, beats up people, robs gas stations, a menace to society, rotten and no count, juvenile delinquent, no good, white trash, all this sort of thing. And then they talk about socias again with the stereotypes: privileged, well dressed, beer blasts, fancy cars. They break windows at fancy parties. They jump greasers for fun. Uh, and again, these are stereotypes, and they're embracing that at this moment because they're about to go to this battle, and they're showing their pride in being a greaser. Again, Ponyboy says they put too much grease in their hair to prepare for this, more than they normally would, because they're trying to fit that stereotype. They're trying to fit that thing. Even though Ponyboy says shortly later on, I don't jump people, I don't rob gas stations, I don't do any of those things. I just hang out with these guys. So he's just kind of following a crowd. So then we get to the actual fight. And the most important thing about it to me, they do talk a little bit, make a bit about Derry's physical stature, and they make a point of having him start the fight. But when he does, a boy steps out named Paul, who Derry was the quarterback for their high school team. He was a great athlete, could have gone to college. Paul was the running back. Apparently, he was also a star athlete. It says halfback in the book, but of course, that's a term for running back. And it talks about how they were both great athletes and they were great friends, used to be really good buddies, hung out all the time in high school. Again, Derry's basically a Soch. And it says now they're looking at each other with this hatred, like something flickers in Derry's eyes for just a moment, like this moment of hesitation of this is my friend. And then it ices over again, and they're staring at each other with all this hatred. And Ponyboy, he posits some reasons. Maybe it's pity that one's feeling for the other. Maybe it's hate for what they represent, hate because they're on opposite sides of this thing. But there's something there that's almost like it's because of the fact that they were friends that causes them to hate each other now. And I'll go ahead and give you the discussion question for today. Which is going to wreck the day of the people who skipped to the end of the video looking for it. But the discussion question for today is, why do Derry and Paul look at each other with so much hatred? I think Ponyboy gives some good possibilities, but he doesn't know for sure. I have some guesses of my own, but I'm not going to say that they're 100% accurate, and I'm not going to spoil it for you right now by trying to put my opinion on yours. So why do you think, based on what little we get on page 142 in my version, again, I assume it's probably the same in yours, why do we think this former quarterback and running back who played football together, which if you've been on sports teams, you know that you can get close to the people you play with. They spent years of high school together, probably thought they were going to go to college and play together until Derry lost his parents. Why do they look at each other with so much hatred now? Why is there so much bitterness there, that icy stare that they've got for each other? What is it about their relationship that's caused that? That's the discussion question. Why do they hate each other so much now? I'm thinking 3 or 4 sentences on that. Okay, so give me a good thought out answer. And then the fight's about to start. Dally runs up, says he used the switchblade. Again, that foreshadowing from earlier on to threaten the nurse and get out of the hospital. So he's there, even though he's got a badly burned arm that he can barely use. And so they all start fighting. Ponyboy gets a pretty bad deal of it, gets beaten on pretty well, considering he's a 14-year-old kid fighting a bunch of older teenagers. And yes, I keep messing with the side of my hair because I washed my hair this morning and it's super curly. I'm sorry, I look ridiculous. Any of you with thick curly hair know the feeling, I'm sure. But so they fight, and eventually 2-Bit with blood running down his face and a busted up hand yells, "They're running, we beat them," which they do, which you could probably expect to happen even if they are outnumbered and probably outsized. These are a bunch of kids who fight on the streets on a daily basis versus a bunch of rich kids who only jump people for fun. The Socs probably don't have nearly as much invested in this as the Greasers. They probably don't want it nearly as much, and they're probably not as experienced as fighters. You can take someone who's bigger and stronger and doesn't know how to fight, and they might lose a fight to a smaller, more experienced person. It can happen, and that's what happens for the most part in this case. So the Socs leave. The Greasers have won. Of course, we know this probably doesn't change a thing. The Socs are probably going to keep doing what they're doing. The Greasers are probably going to keep doing what they've been doing, because there's no contract here. There's no legal obligation. There's nothing stopping the Socs from continuing to jump Greasers and continuing to throw parties and do whatever they want. It's not going to matter to them, which is why they probably didn't want it as much. The Greasers see it as this symbol of their superiority of having asserted themselves over these richer kids, but it's not really going to matter. And it's not really important, as we see very shortly after this. Dally grabs Pony, and because he knows that Pony's the closest person to Johnny besides him, and he says, "Let's go. We gotta go see Johnny." So he busts out of the hospital to get in this rumble because it's important to him. He feels like he's fighting for Johnny, and then they go to visit him afterward. Pony, of course, pretends to be sick for the policeman and all that, but they get there to Johnny. Before they get there, the thing I wanted to point out, Dally's talk on page 147, where he says, "I was crazy, that kid, crazy for wanting Johnny to stay out of trouble, for not wanting him to get hard. If he'd been like me, he'd never have been in this mess. If he'd got smart like me, he'd never have run into that church. That's what you get for helping people. Editorials in the paper and a lot of trouble. You better wise up, Pony. You get tough like me and you don't get hurt. You look out for yourself and nothing can touch you." This sounds to me a lot like someone trying to cover what they're truly feeling. And I think what Pony says, he says, "I had a stupid feeling that Dally was out of his mind the way he kept raving, but I think now I would have understood if I hadn't been so sick at the time." Reading this, I think I get it, because I've heard people talk like this. He's saying a lot of things he doesn't really believe. He's very proud of Johnny. I think feels like Johnny was better than he was, and that Johnny did rush to that church to save those kids. He's just desperately upset at what has happened to Johnny now that he wasn't able to do anything about it. And he's really afraid of losing him. I think that's what we're looking at here. And all this talk about being tough and nothing affecting you, this is clearly affecting Dally pretty badly. The situation that Johnny's in and the possibility of losing him is weighing on him heavily. And we see that as they get into the hospital. The doctor says he's dying. Dally pulls out the switchblade to threaten the doctor. The doctor's completely unfazed. He says, "Look, you can see him because you're his friends, not because you've got a knife." So Dally puts the knife away. They go in to see him. And Johnny can barely speak. He looks dead when they get there. He says, "Hey," softly. He's kind of sunk down into the bed. He's really pale. Dally's telling him, "We beat the Socs. We stomped them, chased them out of our territory," which we know that's probably not true. And Johnny says the thing that I'm thinking the whole time they're fighting, and that I think S.E. Hinton wants us to think: useless, fighting's no good. While Johnny's lying here in bed dying, Dally breaks out of the hospital to go fight, presumably for Johnny. I don't know, for his honor, for revenge. There's not really a reason to it, right? The Socs didn't throw a burning church on Johnny. Yeah, they beat him once, and they're the cause of him having killed Bob. I mean, they are the indirect cause of all of this. But no Soc specifically threw a burning church on Johnny's back. So this vengeance or justification, whatever Dally's looking for, he's looking for it in the wrong places, which is a lot of the problem with people in this book in general. They look for things in the wrong places, and they don't know what they're looking for in the first place. So Johnny says, "Useless, fighting's no good." Johnny doesn't care. He's realized at this point, when he's fading away pretty quickly, he's dying, that none of that mattered. It wasn't important. And Dally says, "They're still writing editorials about you for being a hero, all this sort of thing." And he tells him how proud they are of him. And this does matter to Johnny. Johnny still looks up to Dally as this hero, this gallant Southern gentleman type, again, that Gone with the Wind reference. And Johnny says, it says Johnny's eyes glowed. He was so happy that Dally was proud of him in that moment, and again, we think that's a lot of the motivation for going in that burning church, to emulate what he thinks Dally is, because he sees Dally as this hero, even if he's not really one, which is up for debate. He has some heroic qualities, but even if Dally's not a hero, Johnny sees him as one, and Johnny's trying to imitate that. He's trying to imitate his hero, and so he does something heroic. And then Johnny says, "Pony boy." He looks at Pony, says you could barely hear him, leans over. And one of the most important little sections of this book, that this chapter in general kind of encapsulates what the whole book's about, I think, with how it plays the fight against Johnny's death, and how pointless the fight was. It says, "Stay gold, Pony boy, stay gold. The pillow seemed to sink a little, and Johnny died." So stay gold, again, it's quoting from that poem, "Nothing Gold Can Stay" by Robert Frost, that Pony boy has memorized, that he quoted off to Johnny. Johnny has remembered this, and it's the last thing on his mind as he dies, to tell Pony boy, "Stay gold." And we talked about the meaning of it and interpreted it a little bit. And again, I may do a video where I go more in depth on the intertextuality in the book. And and focus on specific instances like Gone with the Wind and Nothing Gold Can Stay. And there's another one where Jack London's referenced. You guys read Call of the Wild at the beginning of the year. Some of you probably perked your ears up when you thought of that. How at the Rumble they're circling, and it's kind of invoking this man versus nature idea of the mob mentality that they get in these gangs, where they cease to be individuals and they're like wolves. You know, they're just waiting for blood basically to jump. We read in Call of the Wild where they would circle the dog, and then when there was blood, when one showed a sign of weakness, they would all jump on it. That's kind of this thing here. He's implying, or Hinton's implying through Ponyboy, the mindlessness of the violence and the fact that it's not civilized, it's not human, it's animalistic. Again, showing the senselessness and stupidity of it through intertextuality, through referencing Jack London books like Call of the Wild, White Fang, which I thought was a pretty good reference for our class specifically, considering we'd read that. But back to Nothing Gold Can Stay, we talked in our discussion question, most of you, I think, hit the nail on the head pretty well. It's a poem about how things that are good, things that are really great and beautiful, golden, because, you know, we use gold as a symbol of richness and beauty and wealth. It can't remain. It's something. It's going to fade. Like sunsets, they're temporary and then they fade. Flowers, you know, good things that we enjoy, youth, health, they fade away. They go away eventually. Basically, nothing in this mortal world is eternal. Nothing that we have here in front of us in our lives can stay forever. But Johnny looks at Ponyboy and he says, "Stay gold." Okay, and this is probably the most famous line from this book. I told you that the opening lines were pretty famous. The bit about coming out of the movie theater, when I stepped out into the bright sunlight from the darkness of the movie house, I had only two things on my mind: Paul Newman and a ride home. That's pretty famous. But "Stay gold" is more so. It's probably the thing from this book that you'll hear throughout life, that you'll remember it from that. You'll hear people quote this. You'll see it quoted in places. And again, it's quoting something else. It's not even an original quote. It's coming from Nothing Gold Can Stay, but it's appropriating it. It's flipping it. Frost says nothing gold can stay. Johnny says stay gold. Okay, so, and I thought seriously about asking you for your discussion question, why does he tell Ponyboy to stay gold? But I thought it was too close to the one we had earlier, and I think I'm going to come up with something a little bit bigger for this question. I think we may do an essay on it. Yeah, we're still going to write an essay on this. I'm sorry. Speaking of, we do have 1 month left of classes officially, so congratulations on that. I'm sure you guys are thrilled. It's mixed for me. I'm kind of happy, but kind of not. Anyway, so, and then Ponyboy, of course, says, you know, you read about people looking peacefully asleep when they're dead. They don't. Johnny just looked dead. In my experience, that's pretty true as well. And Dally is pretty upset about this. He's swearing. He's beating against the wall. He's saying, "Johnny, don't die. Please don't die." Johnny's already dead. He knows this. But he's kind of having a break with reality, it seems. We can go back to that conversation he and Pony had in the car ride, and how it seems like Dally's traumatized. He's dealing with a lot internally. It says he suddenly bolted through the door and down the hall. And this is a little bit more foreshadowing. Hinton does this a lot. She shows glimpses of what we can kind of expect. And as you can tell, this book is not done being pretty eventful. Things are not over. But this is, to me, probably the most important chapter of the book. So if you haven't read it, go back and read through it. Think about those moments of intertextuality in it. Think about how it contrasts the senselessness, and it invokes that man versus nature within to the man versus society conflict. And it mixes all those things in. It's really the most sophisticated piece of writing in the book. So go back and look through it. Discussion question, again, was, I think, about the 6 or 7 minute mark of the video. It was in the middle. So go back and check that if you haven't. Answer that before the day's up. See you guys.